Thank you so much for having me today on what I consider to be one of our most sacred days of the year, especially in the world of social studies education. It would not be a MLK Day unless we obviously quoted his prophetic words. And so I'll start with a quote from him that reminds me of exactly what we're going through right now. He said, "Change does not roll in on the wheels of inevitability, but comes through continuous struggle." And the reason that this quote struck me is because I think about the context of our current struggles and what we've seen over the last several years, and especially as they've heightened in the last month. And that's our society crying out for change. As I look into the crowds of the people that are making their voices heard across not just Kentucky, but the United States, I often notice that it is our young people who are leading the way. And as a teacher, I'm proud to see that so many young people have engaged in the peaceful process and demand that their elected officials, enact positive change in their communities. And I am obviously immensely proud of the way that you, our educators, have responded as well. And I've always said this to be true, that public education was made to meet this moment. This is what we were built to do. And as Secretary of Education and Workforce Development Cabinet, as well as Lieutenant Governor, I have a unique opportunity to try to enact change that will lift up the voices of all Kentuckians. And so I want to tell you a couple of ways that we're working on doing that first before I introduce who you all came to see. The first plan that we have is to implement statewide implicit bias training for all school faculty and staff. That is going to make sure that we confront the issues of bias that every one of us harbor. And I think the first step to moving past that is to admitting that it exists, especially in the event that that bias is hindering a child's education, because that's certainly not something that we want to happen. We're also working to make sure that Kentucky becomes the first state in the country that requires this of every school system across the state. And I think that would speak volumes about the expectation that we have for the very people who are raising up the next generation of Kentuckians, because that implicit bias training isn't just for those teachers. It is for the relationship that those teachers will continue to build with their students over time. Another initiative that we're working on is to recruit more people of color to become teachers. I firmly believe that our teachers are the first leaders outside of their home that many kids are exposed to. And so our kids should be able to see themselves in those leaders. And so we are working diligently to make sure that we are intentional about that recruitment and retainment of more teachers of color. And we're also going to be partnering with our systems of higher education, like our historically Black colleges in Kentucky, which is Kentucky State and Simmons, to recruit tomorrow's leaders. And so that's what I've been working on. But I will tell you that when I was in the classroom, I got to learn from Dr. Kathy Swan. And I was able to take her method of the inquiry design model and utilize it in my classroom. And I have to tell you that it was one of the best tools that I was able to pick up as a teacher in the classroom, because of what it provided to me in terms of planning, but also the opportunities that it created for my students. And so I come to you as I've drank the Kool-Aid. I'm on the team, I've been on the team, and I'm really excited for you guys to learn more about it and hear more about what Dr. Crowley and Dr. Swan have been working on, and how you can take this IDM and use it to implement justice-oriented approaches in your classroom when it comes to Black history and culture, and utilizing the inquiry design model to do just that. And so with all of that said, I will turn it over to the stars of the show, which is Dr. Kathy Swan and Dr. Ryan Crowley.
Oh, thanks so much. Lieutenant Governor Coleman. Thank you so much. And I'm going to share a screen. Walking and chewing gum at the same time is a little hard for me. So there we go. We got a PowerPoint so we can profess. So thank you all so much for being here on a Monday in January to talk a little bit about inquiry and how we can use inquiry-based teaching to think about justice and inequity in society. So together with my colleague, Dr. Ryan Crowley, Ryan and I are both faculty at the University of Kentucky in the College of Ed. I'm told that I'm a little bit bossy, and so I've sort of embraced that. I'm a little loosey in the Peanuts character, and Ryan helps to smooth things over, keep things peaceful as Linus. So we're excited to be with you over the next hour or so. When we were asked to do this, of course, Zoom, it's been a year of Zoom for all of us. I had a Zoom with my mom for the first time this Saturday night, and it was the first time she had done Zoom, and she just was like, it's like you're in the room with me. And so now she's addicted to Zoom at the very time where I'm trying to stop Zooming as much. But it feels a little punitive for educators to be on Zoom on this day of remembrance, and yet here we are. So what we've tried to do, Ryan and I, is create an agenda where we're hoping we can use some of the interactive features of Zoom. So it's not just us talking for an hour, but really that you're participating. And so we're going to start with introductions. Boom, check, we did that. So we got that out of the way. Then we thought we'd start and really talk about inquiry, sort of the foundations of inquiry, why it matters here in Kentucky and why it matters in social studies classrooms. So we're gonna do that, get that out of the way, and then really spend the bulk of our time on an inquiry that Ryan and I have been writing over the last few weeks with a compelling question: how should we remember Martin Luther King Jr.? And our hope is to do a bit of a cooking show. So that you feel like you're participating, and that at the end of this presentation that you could go do inquiry in your own classroom or promote it in your own setting. And then we've got a big finish. So you'll have to wait for that, but we'll have a drum roll and everything towards the end. So that's our agenda for the hour and what we hope to accomplish. So let's go ahead and get started with foundations of inquiry. So about 10 years ago, social studies was left behind. We're still sort of fighting for space in the curriculum, but certainly about 10 years ago, English language arts and mathematics had really taken the oxygen from social studies in schools, and social studies educators all over the country were like, wait, but we do important stuff too. We teach students how to become citizens. But we really needed to go through sort of a rebranding, rethinking campaign, because the old, tired social studies wasn't really making a case for us. And so a bunch of educators from across the country that really cared about civic education and social studies education said, look, let's make it about inquiry. Social studies is all about inquiry because humans inquire, citizens inquire, and inquiry is fundamental to good education, not just in social studies, but in science, math, English, etc. So we all agreed it was great. But the next problem was trying to define, what did we mean by inquiry? Inquiry is one of those words that's been around in education for a long, long time, but it's fairly fuzzy, particularly in social studies. And so the job was really to make inquiry clear, to define inquiry, to create a vernacular for social studies teachers so they could actually do inquiry, or at least know that when they were doing it in the classroom. And so Kentucky got aboard that train. And then in February of 2019, which just seems like it could be 100 years ago, but it was really just a year and a half ago, passed new standards in social studies where inquiry was at the heart of what social studies should be doing in the classroom. And so that inquiry is defined by 4 really important instructional practices. One, inquiry begins with a question. So questioning is one of those practices. Students should investigate questions using content, right? Civics, economics, geography, history. They should use our content disciplines to really inform their understanding of those important questions that we ask in social studies. And then students to turn their attention to evidence, right? To first of primary, secondary, tertiary sources, to cull those sources for evidence that would support their answers to those compelling and supporting questions. And that ultimately, the magic happens when students are able to communicate their conclusions through arguments and through action, that they actually do something with what they've learned in a social studies classroom. So together, those 4 inquiry practices created contours, language, definition for Kentucky social studies educators to begin thinking about shifting their practice or solidifying their practice in inquiry. Now, spoiler alert for those educators out there, students are going to need lots of support to be able to do inquiry. We call this scaffolding, right? Where we come alongside students and help them build better questions, learn how to analyze sources, interrogate the historical record, and then create coherent evidentiary answers to those compelling and supporting questions. They need lots and lots of guidance. So over the last 10 years, my colleagues, S.G. Grant and John Lee and I, and more recently, Ryan Crowley and I, have been working on this thing that Lieutenant Governor Coleman talked about, which is the inquiry design model, or what we call for short IDM. And IDM is really an approach to teaching social studies content using questions, tasks, and sources as the elements or fundamentals of good inquiry. So when we talk about questions, we talk about big idea, big inquiry questions called compelling questions. We talk about supporting questions that help students break apart those big questions. We talk about formative performance tasks and summative performance tasks. Formative performance tasks so that they can learn content, build their capacity for inquiry, that we can check their understanding in order to demonstrate that understanding in summative tasks, and that ultimately students are using sources, for primary, secondary, tertiary sources in order to complete those tasks, in order to answer those questions. So questions, tasks, and sources as really the instructional building blocks of inquiry. Now we represent those 3 building blocks on a thing we call a blueprint. It isn't quite a lesson plan. It's not quite a unit plan. We call it a blueprint because it sort of sits in between those 2 things. It's a 1-page representation of the questions, the tasks, and the sources that a teacher might use to scaffold an inquiry in their classroom. And so we like the 1-page approach because we don't want it to be too prescriptive. We've got about 200 educators on this phone, and my guess is my class is very different than your class, is very different than Ryan's class, is very different than Jared's class, etc. And so we wanted to honor teacher craft, knowing that you would have to adapt instruction for your particular group of students, whether they're elementary, middle, or high. Or as a former teacher myself, oftentimes I had to adapt instruction from first period to second period to 7th period. So we wanted that sort of flexibility, fluidity with this type of curricular plan. But instead of just blah-blahing about how great IDM is, we thought we might walk you through this blueprint that we've been working on over the last few weeks. Before I do, I just wanted to point you to this website. I have a website along with my colleagues called C3 Teachers. And so if you go up there, it's free. And there are about 400 blueprints or inquiries that are up there that are available both in PDF and Word. And so we have a Creative Commons license so that teachers from Kentucky can beg, borrow, steal inquiries from all over the country and adapt and modify them for their own classroom here in Kentucky. And you'll be happy to know that Kentucky has a very strong presence up on C3 Teachers as well. We have a bunch of inquiries that are also published, but inquiries are available K to 12. And so happy hunting along with IBM resources. Where we thought we would spend the bulk of our time today is actually doing an inquiry, what we call in ed schools micro-teaches, where we take 3 to 4 days worth of instruction and we collapse it down, in this case, to about 20, 25 minutes. So I've been recently calling that a cooking show. So this is Ryan and Kathy's cooking show, where you'll learn how to do your first or maybe 10th inquiry souffle. It came as no surprise as we were preparing for this that we felt like we really needed to honor the special nature of today as MLK Day. And so we ended up, like I said, writing this inquiry around this iconic figure in US history, Martin Luther King Jr. So you can see this is the overall blueprint. It's got 3 supporting questions. It's got compelling and supporting. It's got formative and summative performance tasks. And it's got ultimately sources that students worked through. And so what we thought Ryan and I might do is break this apart into instructional stages so that you might see how this could unfold in a classroom. So to begin, let's start with the compelling question. The compelling question is the North Star of an inquiry. It's for you Big Lebowski fans, it's the rug that ties the room together. It's the reason we're inquiring in the first place. And so our question for this blueprint is, how should we remember Martin Luther King Jr.? And this is one of those questions, sort of types that I use over and over again, inserting different names, because I think oftentimes in history, we have simplistic understandings of these really complex figures in history. And so when I work with students, I like to say, I'm pretty complex. You're pretty complex, you know? And so when we look back in the past, we want to make sure that we think about humans as having dimension, and that remembering them is a historical act. And so I was watching the 15-minute video that sort of started us off, and both of the historians, particularly the public historian who was curating this exhibit, was talking about how do we remember this particular time using all sorts of archival objects in order to understand diverse perspectives. And so that's what we're going to do in this inquiry. We're going to sort of play with, you know, sort of traditional ways of remembering MLK and more complex ways. But talk too long. One of the first things that you do in an inquiry, if this was day one, if it was Monday, and if I were with a group of students, I was going to start this inquiry, I'd start by staging the inquiry. And what we mean by staging is a hook exercise, an anticipatory set, something that has some energy behind it that might get the students excited or interested, intellectually interested in the compelling question. And so that's what we're going to do. We had hoped that we could do breakout rooms, but I think we're having a little tech. I don't think we're going to be able to do that. But what we are going to be able to do is start with this question. If I were coming to you guys and you guys were my students, I would say, all right, let's start here. What do you know about Martin Luther King Jr.? And so what I'd like you to do is in the chat box, if it's available to you, just start putting some things that you know about Martin Luther King Jr. Maybe you are talking to your children today. Maybe you're talking to others. Maybe you're talking to us. What are some things that you think we need to remember about Martin Luther King Jr.? So great. Oh my, look at the chat boxes firing up. So that he was a leader, Krista says, that he was an advocate for civil rights, Nora says, that he was married, Karen. He was a nonviolent activist. He was a minister. He led many peaceful protests, speakers, freedom fighter. I see Mallory. Mallory's one of our students. Good job, Mallory. Had a philosophy of nonviolence, was an activist. Karen says civil rights activist. So good. Excellent. Wonderful. All right. So maybe I would play with that a little bit if we weren't in a cooking show. But once we sort of got a grasp and sort of recalled who this person was, I might say, look, we are going to engage in an exercise where I'm going to give you 20 iconic photographs of Martin Luther King Jr. And we're going to say, Life magazine just called us, and they want to do a 2021 issue that's dedicated to the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. What image should go on the front of Life magazine, right? So normally we would put you in breakout groups, but apparently the Zoom that we're using doesn't have that capability. So I want you to pry your child away from PlayStation. That's what I would have to do, or grab your dog or bunny rabbit. And what I want you to do is go into the chat box. And I think Ryan is going to put, or Melanie is going to put a link to the images. So is it in there? So hopefully you can grab that link and open up the PDF. And what you'll notice is we've numbered each of the images 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And what we'd like you to do is either in your own breakout room of one, or your breakout room with your pet or child, we'd like you to have a conversation. We're going to give you 2 or 3 minutes to sort of come up with an argument for why this picture belongs on the cover of Life magazine. And so, like a good teacher, I just looked at the time. And so we're going to speed up. So Ryan, take it away. Ask for some volunteers.
All right, so let's try to get just a couple folks that would share. So again, we're thinking about, I know we didn't give you hardly enough time to look at those images, but there are 20 images in there. So if there's any volunteers that would want to talk, I believe we have the capacity to let you actually speak. So how about Shauna? Sorry, Shauna said, oh wait, Shauna says, my son Jeff and I went with 1. I'm assuming that's number 1. So number 1 is King sort of locked arm in arm with other protesters because it shows unity among each other. Very nice. Thank you, Shauna. Could we get maybe another person? So it says, I guess we have to raise our hand.
So Oliver raised his hand.
All right, so Oliver's raised his hand. So could we let him speak?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I picked number 6 because it depicts power, and it shows how powerful this man was in the eyes of the government and the people.
All right, so Oliver, number 6, for those of you who've looked through, Oliver is one where he's sitting at talking with LBJ. It looks like they're in the White House. That's great. So you're thinking about power, and And just this idea that MLK was certainly like at seats of power in the US, right? That he was having conversations with LBJ, pressuring him on voting rights and other civil rights issues. So,
Yes.
so that's excellent. Thank you, Oliver. How about, is there anyone else has a hand raised?
Angela Clay raised her hand.
Can we let Angela speak?
Hi, how are you?
Hey, Angela, we know you.
Yes, ma'am. How are you?
Good.
I would pick image number 19 with him and Malcolm X, because so many times in history, we try to pit them two against each other. One standing for nonviolence and one standing for violence, but this shows that they actually had some type of common ground and where we can find their commonality between the both of them.
Oh, Angela is looking ahead to our presentation because we're going to kind of get to that. So that was very nice, right? So we often think about MLK as kind of juxtaposed with Malcolm X. That's sort of the simplistic narrative that we hear. For those of you that know a lot about his life, you know that he wasn't all that. He had sympathies and sort of views that align with parts of the Black Power movement, and vice versa with Malcolm X respecting what Martin Luther King and his folks were doing. So I think that's good for our participants. I appreciate all that shared. It's a little bit of a tough venue to do this in. So let me keep rolling here. So what we're doing now, and just to kind of like step back as a teacher here, is thinking about what I'm thinking about with this inquiry, with this question, how should we remember Martin Luther King Jr., is we're thinking about, we have these master narratives, right, about MLK that float around in our consciousness, I mean, in our textbooks for sure, and sort of our popular culture and our popular imagination. And then there's also, and those ways are oftentimes, sanitized and simplistic narratives. And so the goal of this inquiry overall is to highlight those more simplistic, sanitized narratives because they're important to talk about what they are and also why they're there. And then to move beyond that and try to think, well, what's incomplete? What's not quite right about these? What are they leaving out? And I know some of my students and Kathy and I students are out here and they get sick of me talking about this. This is the drum I beat all the time, but this idea of always trying to figure out, why is MLK remembered this way in our textbooks? Okay, let's talk about how it is. Why is he remembered that way? Why does that give us comfort? And then how can we complicate that and then create a new understanding of MLK and just kind of keep that process going on and on and on, because we know that historical figures are complex, right? So now we're getting into the supporting questions of the inquiry. So 3 questions. You can see them across the way here. So who is MLK and what did he accomplish? Question number 1. How has MLK been remembered, which is supporting question number 2. And why might these 3 depictions that we highlight in supporting question number 2, why might they be inadequate or problematic? So we're going to look at each of these in a little more detail. And again, this is a cooking show, so we're not going to dive in and look at sources for all of these, but just kind of want to show you what this would look like in practice. So supporting question 1 is really is a way to give the kind of basic background for your students in MLK's life and what he accomplished. So who was he, what he accomplished? The task that accompanies this is to create a timeline that defines the kind of key events of his life. So that's sort of, the nuts and bolts. Who is he and what did he do? And let's move to question 2 now. Now here is where we're getting at, what are these master narratives? What are these common ways that we remember Dr. King? And particularly these claims that we have written out here, this is not us making these claims. This is sort of like, these are claims that students are tasked with either finding evidence to support or refute, okay? So 3 common claims, and I think for those of you in the audience who know this stuff well, this will be familiar with you, these ideas that MLK should be and has been remembered as a messiah figure, that MLK is and has been remembered as kind of the embodiment of the civil rights movement. He is civil rights, as they say, where they say Rosa sat down and Martin stood up. That real simplistic narrative about the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s. And then claim number 3 is that MLK should be remembered for his moderation, that aspect of his voice. And there's lots of evidence for all 3 of these being true, and they're not, they are master narratives because there are truth in all of these, right? But they're also incomplete. So that moves us to question number 3. So looking at these 3 in particular. Here's our 3 claims. So we're historians. We're going to kind of look for evidence for these claims. So let's look at claim number 1, that MLK is often depicted as this messiah figure. And the language that he's talked about in textbooks evidences this in a major way. Clearly, images like this from the March on Washington always have him, kind of in this messianic sort of pose. This is major, Sermon on the Mount vibes, you might say, coming from this photograph. And again, there'd be lots of photographs and some textual sources, excerpts from speeches that could support this. We're just giving you a little kind of glimpse of one source that might be used there. So getting to claim number 2, that is the embodiment of the civil rights movement. This is something that you see on the the National Mall in Washington, D.C., huge memorial for Martin Luther King. He's got a holiday today. He is one of the more recognizable figures in U.S. history, period, and certainly the most recognizable from the civil rights era, right? So in what ways do we think of him as just an all-encompassing figure that embodies this movement? And there at the bottom is an image of him at the signing, I believe that's of the Civil Rights Act in 1964 with LBJ. Big moment there. He is kind of at the center of that scene. And then the third claim that we're going to spend a little more time on here is this idea that MLK is a moderate. So Angela, the sort of perfect student there who just spoke up, the last person to share their view on those images, talked about how she selected the photo of him shaking hands with Malcolm X because that actually shows his connection, the connections between those two. When in reality, in textbooks and the way we think about him, he's almost always juxtaposed, contrasted with Malcolm X, right? And this is just a meme. And so maybe, good historians wouldn't want to use a meme as a source, but I think memes are great sources because these are sort of the ways that our students are processing and information. So aside from maybe fact checking to make sure these folks actually said these 2 things, what we see here is a very clear attempt to kind of paint Dr. King as this moderate, I want my children judged by the color of their skin, not the content of not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. That's kind of this classic phrase from the I Have a Dream speech that's actually kind of been co-opted to promote this idea of color blindness, which is crazy to think about. And then below this much more militant statement by Malcolm X. And so if you just glimpse at this, it gives you the idea that these folks are polar opposites from one another, right? And in the way that we think about it in the popular imagination is that, we like the sort of MLK, I Have a Dream, Malcolm X, Black Power, Black nationalism. That's kind of, where the civil rights movement went astray, according to a lot of popular understandings. Okay, so there's MLK as a moderate. So that supporting question 2, we're looking at those claims. We're finding evidence for them in textual and photographic sources and other sources, and we're building our understanding of those claims. And then we move to supporting question 3. And this one is really all about trying to highlight how those other depictions are really incomplete, right? If you really want to know who MLK was as a person, you have to explore all of these aspects of his background. Okay, so a lot of our framing of this inquiry drew from this article by Derek Aldridge, who's a professor at University of Georgia, and he did an analysis of how textbooks talk about King, and then he kind of problematized them. So that's a source that drives a lot of this. So let's look at just by one quick example here that you can put up this other idea of MLK, right? That actually he had this real radical agenda that we don't often talk about, right? Like we associate radical with Black Power, Black nationalism, Malcolm X. We don't associate with MLK, but he had some very radical views that don't come up in our textbooks, right? So his opposition to the war in Vietnam, which began really in full force in 1966, 67, really famous speech he gave in 1967 at Riverside Baptist Church in New York. And then his advocacy from at that point on were very radical. And it's interesting to talk about, and we would want our students to explore with this, is that why don't we remember him as a radical, right? Why do we talk about I Have a Dream speech, but we don't talk about this Beyond Vietnam speech, which is really an incendiary speech. And then there's other aspects that would come in here, right? His support of the Poor People's Campaign and his other advocacy that he did against economic inequality. And it was really a critic of US capitalism, critic of US foreign policy, critic of US capitalism. And so those are those more radical parts that we don't hear about. So let's go to the next. So I believe Kathy's going to talk here is now we've worked through those 3 supporting questions, and now we're kind of getting to the argument, right? Getting back to that compelling question and constructing an argument.
Yeah, so at the heart of inquiry is this notion of deliberation, that students are deliberating around a compelling question using the historical record or what we have of the historical record. And in some cases, acknowledging that part of that historical record is unknown or missing, etc. But ultimately, all roads lead to having students construct an argument supported with evidence. And so in this case, students answer that compelling question: how should we remember Dr. King? Using evidence that they've encountered during the supporting questions or the formative work. And so I think one thing that's really important about argumentation, I used to teach US history, I used to teach USAP history, world history, and the 5-paragraph essay or the essay is really important. It's important to get students to write, but arguments can come in different forms. And so here's an example of an argument that's in outline form where students make a claim. In textbooks and in the popular imagination, MLK is often remembered as heroic yet moderate figure who solely represents the broader civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. And they've pulled pieces of evidence in order to support that claim. But I think one of the most important parts about inquiry and about training students to be good citizens is that they're able to acknowledge the other side. So counterclaims are as important as claims, right? So that they can hold thoughts in their head. They may feel or believe in claim 1, but they acknowledge that there are other ways to look, in this case, about Dr. Martin Luther King. So you can see that counterclaim along with the evidence. And so I think one of the things that teachers rightfully get concerned about with inquiry or any sort of larger, intricate way of teaching is the grading that comes alongside of it. And so we definitely wanted to show the kinds of things that students could create without you walking home or downloading 100, 5-paragraph essays to grade. That ultimately what we're really interested in is the clarity of thought and the crispness of thought that I think this outline demonstrates. But we like ourselves pros too. And so this is another example of a paragraph that, would represent sort of the macro argument that then students could fill in with the evidence and the mini claims that they've encountered during the inquiry. Argumentation is important. We want students to learn how to be thoughtful consumers of information and be able to marshal evidence in order to answer questions. But we feel that social studies needs to not just be an academic exercise, but a doing class, that students need to bring that knowledge to bear to make a better society. And so we have this place that ends every blueprint called Taking Informed Action, with the emphasis on informed, right? Where students are taking the information that they've learned and applying it in some sort of civic space. And so the Taking Informed Action exercise that we created for this is to return back to their textbook. So you'll remember in supporting question 1, students looked at their textbook as a way of creating that timeline. They returned to that textbook entry with a more critical eye and examine that story and the complexity or lack of complexity around Dr. King, and ultimately suggest edits to that entry if it's incomplete, or write, you know, this would probably happen fewer times, but write the publisher on how they got it right. So that's taking informed action. So an example of this, here's a excerpt that was pulled out of a history textbook, The American Pageant, that really presents MLK as a moderate. Really juxtaposing against Malcolm X. And so it gives students an opportunity to apply their knowledge and then to do something about it. So that is our cooking show. We took a little bit more than we had hoped, but the idea is that we hope that you can visualize what that might look like in a classroom. So here's our big finish. We are going to do a little reflection. That's what we do in colleges of education. We do something and then we reflect on it. So we're going to do a couple of reflection points, and then we're going to give you some tools to help you do inquiry. So first, let's talk a little bit about inquiry. So one of the issues that teachers face in social studies is, how do I possibly do inquiry when I have to teach, you know, so many years, so many events, so many ideas in history or in other subject matter? And so there's a real question about efficiency. How do I become really efficient, you know, with inquiry? And so what we try to encourage teachers to do is to think about what all we accomplished here in the last 30 minutes. And like I said, you know, like a good teacher might think of this as an accordion, right? The blueprint as an accordion, where you might compress it if you're like us and running out of time, or that you expand it if you have a little bit more wiggle room. In either case, it's important to recognize that a blueprint allows you to do all 4 inquiry practices. So the first inquiry practices is about questioning, using and having students deliberate compelling and supporting questions. Check, check, we did that. The second is investigating disciplinary ideas, you know, that rest within our 4 core disciplines: civics, economics, geography, and history. I would argue that we touch on content in all 4, or would touch on content in all 4 of those disciplines, primarily though in the discipline of history. And so, you know, there's often this little false dichotomy game that we play in education. Is it about content or is it about skills? And we've got content people, you know, saying, you know, social studies should be about the content. It's just the facts, man. And then you've got the other side, you know, who said, no, they can Google everything. We need them to learn these skills that they can take with them into college and career. In their civic life. Where we come down on that is that you need both. You can't practice skills without content, and content loses meaning without being able to do something with it. And so ultimately, students not only learn content, but they ultimately do something with that content within inquiry. Third, in inquiry practice, using evidence, they're definitely working with sources, extracting evidence from those sources in order to develop evidentiary claims that, fourth, inquiry practice, that they're able to communicate both in terms of a summative argument and in terms of taking informed action. So while I would never argue that inquiry is particularly efficient, what I will say is it does allow you to do all 4 of those inquiry practices in really a seamless and hopefully meaningful way. With that, this presentation was not just about inquiry. It was about inquiry so that it promotes justice and combats inequity. And so we want to talk directly to that. So Ryan, take it away.
So I'm gonna share I put a link there in the chat. That link will take you to a folder with a couple different resources in it. One is there's an article in there that talks about this idea of critical inquiry, which I'm about to talk about in a second. There's also a few pieces that Kathy and some of her colleagues wrote about the C3 framework and IDM in more broad strokes. So those are all can be downloaded and readily available for folks. So ideas I reference coming up are going to be detailed in that article. So we're thinking about how you take inquiry and the structure of inquiry, the inquiry design model, and use it for teaching in a way that actually directly confronts, that identifies and confronts injustice and tries to promote equity. And so what I write about with Dr. LeGarrette King from the University of Missouri, we write about in that article that I just shared, it's this idea of critical inquiry. And so we layer on top of this IDM model is how we take those three components of inquiry design model, the questions, tasks, and the sources, and we ask critical questions. We have students engage in critical tasks and we expose them to more critical sources. And so when I use the word critical, I'm not talking just about being critical of something or engaging in critical thinking. Critical as a paradigm, as a way of thinking, as a way of seeing the world, is about identifying power and how it operates in different environments, and then identifying how that power promotes injustice in different ways, how it creates inequitable relationships between groups and society, and then thinking about how you can remedy those injustices. So it's this sort of, maybe easy to think about it as a twofold thing, right? So it's about identifying inequitable power relationships between groups in society, thinking about where they come from historically, how they exist and sort of reproduce themselves in the contemporary moment, and then what can we do to redress those inequities, okay? And so what we do with inquiry is this great model. Sorry, Kath, I got ahead of myself. Is we take this model that aligns with the Kentucky standards, that aligns with good social studies pedagogical practices, right? But we put this layer on top of it, right? So now when we're asking questions that are specifically steering us to try to identify injustices, right? And when we're putting sources in front of students, we're putting sources that really speak from the perspectives and the experiences of people who've experienced injustice. And when we put tasks in front of students, the goal of those tasks is that they're working towards an understanding that's going to allow them to take some sort of an active role. Okay, so a critical task is not just about organizing information. It's also about thinking about how you put that information that you've gained into operation in society, in the real, even if it's as small as a conversation in the classroom or something bigger, like interacting with people outside your classroom and sharing your concerns and sort of proposing alternatives. So now, one way, a nice term that I've been sort of playing with, and Kathy and I have been talking about for a while, is thinking about how do you drive these critical inquiries? And one of the ways you can do it is by asking these expansive questions, right? So an inquiry is driven by a compelling question. That's, it's what we're here to do. We ask that question, and then in the end, we answer it, right? In the form of an argument of some sort. And I think we can do that in very mundane ways. But if we want to ask questions that really point us toward justice, we need to ask questions that are more expansive. And so I'm going to give you a little example of one here. It's off topic, but it fits well. And then I'll kind of talk about how the MLK question is also expansive. So voting is hot lately, right? We've talked about elections a lot in the last couple months. So one thing that has come up a lot in the last half dozen years or more is this idea of voter identification laws. And I'm sure there's social studies teachers in this audience that have talked about this with their students or engaged in this question in their classes. And this is a common thing that we might see, right? Like, do we need voter identification laws? It seems like a great social studies question. We'll look at the arguments for voter identification. We'll look at the arguments against voter identification. But what I would pose is that in thinking about justice-oriented social studies, asking a more expansive question, this question forces you to engage in this kind of both sides, and in some ways engage in bad faith arguments, right? Because what we know about voter identification is that the people that have promoted it are not doing so for election security. They're doing so to keep people from, certain groups of people from voting. Okay, so I don't want to engage in false bad faith arguments. And so when I think about an expansive question that gets at our voting system, what we do instead is we say, well, how do we make our voting system more inclusive, right? Like, how do we get more people voting, right? That's the type of question that we should be asking, and I think when we do that, when we frame our question differently, it creates a different conversation in the classroom, right? It certainly is going to put different sources in front of our students. It's going to have them do different tasks that make them think about taking action in a different way. But the big thing is it's going to help us imagine new possibilities and new perspectives. I think that's what an expansive question does. And this, how should we remember MLK Jr.? It's also an expansive question, and that what it's doing is it's expanding our understanding of him, right? It's not just, hey, let me tell you how MLK is a radical. It's saying, look, this is the way we remember him in a lot of ways, right? As the moderate, as whatever. Let's talk about let's really dive into that. Why do we do that? And where's the evidence that we do that? And then once we've talked about that, let's look at the ways that those are incomplete. And then at the end, we have this much more expansive, complicated understanding of who he is and what his legacy is. And I think that when we do that, we're much more well-equipped to go out and engage people on this day in particular, but certainly on any day. So that's critical inquiry and expansive questions, which is really kind of putting our focus much more on justice and inequity, layered on top of this good, sound social studies pedagogy.
Nice, great. So now let's take it to the bridge. Let's tell you what you've won. How can we help you do inquiry in social studies classrooms here in Kentucky? Well, first up, let us help promote the next session that's up, which is a group of teachers along with their instructional lead, Ryan New from Jefferson County, who have been putting this in action over the last couple of years. They've taken IDM and they've created a curriculum. They're going to highlight part of that curriculum around Black historical consciousness in this next session. So you already heard a little bit from Angela earlier in this session, and she's going to be featured in this panel. And in so many ways, I think we ended up ceding some of our time to the good teachers from Jefferson County, because I think it's really important to hear how these teachers are making it work in their classroom, despite all of the challenges we face pre and during COVID. So we definitely will be hanging around for that session coming up next. Additionally, C3 teachers. So C3 teachers, like I said, has about 400 and growing inquiries. Ryan and I are going to finish this one up at MLK and post it up on C3 teachers. But hopefully, whether you're an elementary teacher, a middle school, or a high school teacher, you might find resources that will help you do inquiry. And so one of the things that we didn't have time to really, we had to choose a grade level. And so we ended up choosing elementary teachers. But the important thing to know is that inquiry can be done in elementary classrooms. I'm working with 2 groups of elementary teachers, one in Fayette County this week, where they're using the blueprint in order to craft the similar kind of curriculum. And so one of the things that I think is really important to know is that you could take an inquiry like this one on MLK and really think about what would that look like in a 5th grade classroom. You'd probably have to adapt the sources. You'd probably have to adapt the tasks a little bit, but good pedagogy is good pedagogy. And so I encourage everyone who uses C3 teachers to have a really flexible mindset and think about how do you customize and make this thing your own. So C3 teachers is definitely there for you. We have a network. We have about 17,000 teachers from around the world. I like to say galaxy that have joined, and we're growing like gangbusters. So we'd love to have more Kentucky teachers. In addition to that, Ryan and I, along with some of our graduate students, worked with the Southern Poverty Law Center just a few years ago on their Teaching Hard History project. So if you haven't checked that out, I would definitely check it out. I screenshot the work that we did, but there were a group of educators like Ryan and myself from across the country who created resources, et cetera, to help teachers teach hard history. And so I definitely would point you to Teaching Tolerance. They have some great instructional materials and are really thoughtful in their approaches. we're professors, so we write a lot of books. So I'll take this opportunity to promote some of those books. We've written a lot about IDM over the years, and hopefully that will be a resource to teachers who want to do their own inquiries in their classroom. So feel free to check those out, or if you're having trouble sleeping, they might be good for that too. In addition, Ryan put a link to 4 or 5 articles, including an article that I wrote this summer with a couple of doctoral students. One from Jefferson County, his name's Andrew Danner. He might be on here. He's the president of KCSS this year. And another teacher from Illinois, trying to think about, how do I teach about protests, and how do I teach about protests on Zoom? And so there's an article that helps teachers think about, how do you do inquiry in this crazy COVID world that we're living in? And so anyway, those might be good resources to check out. With that said, we're about out of time. And so we'll end with just a thank you for taking the time today to really invest in your teaching practice, sharing ideas with us. We hope that it's been helpful as you think about inquiry in your own classroom or supporting teachers that are doing inquiry. We love to hear from teachers. So those are our emails, our UKY emails. Any last thoughts, Ryan, before we turn it over?
No, I think we covered it. I hope you check out the resources in the folder, and that's it. Thanks so much for being here.
Yeah. All right, everybody, take care.